Podcast Leadership Forum, a conversation with leaders who serve the public good. My name is Trevor Brown, and I'm privileged to serve as Dean of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University, where we aspire to fulfill a simple phrase that Senator John Glenn used to describe what we do: inspire citizenship and develop leadership. I also have the honor of serving as the host of this conversation series. So welcome to a thoughtful and reflective conversation about leadership. I'm joined today by Dr. Reggie Wilkinson, who has had many public service roles, most notably as the director of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections for over 15 years under Governors George Voinovich and Bob Taft. Upon retiring from state service, he led the Business Alliance for Higher Education and the Economy, which was connected with the Ohio Business Roundtable, and the Ohio College Access Network. He later joined the Tiffin University Board of Trustees and now serves as a member of the Ohio State University Board of Trustees. In addition to serving on a variety of other boards, several of which are in the corrections and law enforcement space, he is the president of Connecting the Dots LLC, a consulting company. Reggie, welcome to our podcast, and thank you for joining me for a conversation about leadership in the public sector.
My pleasure, Trevor.
So Reggie, you served for just over 15 years from 1991 to 2006 as the director of the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections here in Ohio. What were the key challenges facing the organization when you stepped into the role, and what leadership approach did you take to those issues?
Back in the early 90s, actually extends earlier to the late 80s. Prison systems were experiencing tremendous population growth, which means that we had to build more prisons. We had to work with county jail systems in order to kind of help schedule when we could receive certain persons being committed to the state facilities. Probation caseloads were expanding commensurate with the prison population. So it was a very challenging time. We looked at it as if it was just another part of the job. It wasn't easy by any stretch of the imagination. The main thing that we had to do is to make sure we had a solid executive team, people who were talented enough to ask the what if questions, people who were experienced in making sure that we were fulfilling all of our constitutional requirements, and there are quite a few in this business. So there was a lot that we had to do. I spent a lot of time as the head of the agency working closely with the legislature, other stakeholder groups, because as the head of the agency, is just not the internal environment that's important. The external one becomes equally as interesting and important in carrying out, that role.
So let's start there then. That external role. What was your approach to the state legislature? How did you bring forward whatever the case was to secure the funding, perhaps to build out the prisons you were describing? And what were some approaches that worked and some that didn't?
Well, of course, you always have to present a budget and eventually defend that budget once it's signed off by the governor's office. But I didn't want to wait until the budget time to, make sure the key legislative members knew what our agency was engaged in and what our concerns were. So I spent a lot of time on both sides of the aisle, talking to committee chairpersons and people in strategic positions in the Ohio General Assembly to help educate them about the agency. And so I thought, so when the time came that, we had to present our budgets, then some of the issues that we were working on would not be foreign to them. And that seemed to be a good strategy, from my perspective, and apparently from theirs as well. because I was typically well received during budget time.
So you came up as an insider. You were a warden and then deputy director. Talk about the advantage, disadvantage of coming into a role like that as someone who knew the system and the organization well. Did that make it easier to transition away from sort of that inside management and say, I can focus on the outside because I know the stuff so well? Or did it make it harder because you knew all the things that needed to happen inside the system?
Well, the answer was probably yes, to both parts. I mean, it was hard because I didn't want to presume that I had, that I knew the system well enough that, I could, get what I wanted, and that was absolutely, the right thing to be thinking about because I didn't know, it's not, is sometimes is only when you're in that seat when things become, apparent that are differently important than previous positions, such as the deputy director or prison warden. As a prison warden, you don't lobby the legislature. As the director of the agency, that's a major part of your job. In fact, every person who is the head of a state agency is a certified lobbyist. We had to file for our lobbying card, every year. And so, I mean, within rules, of course, but we were allowed and expected to make sure the members of the General Assembly understood our departments.
So you said that your strategy was effective. You were well received when budget times came around, and part of the strategy was just educating legislators about the work that the agency does. Do you recall legislators who weren't convinced by your appeals and who were perhaps not so supportive? And how did you approach those folks who didn't necessarily agree with not only your budget request, but just the whole purpose of rehabilitation and corrections?
Well, I knew that there would be, points in time when individual legislators would, not necessarily agree with not necessarily me, but something the department stood for in their minds. Which is why it's important to, make sure leadership understands, what you're doing. The president of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, key, chairpersons, and if there is a member of a committee or someone who's not in that level of leadership in the legislature, sometimes it can offset, but it doesn't mean that we disregard that person because you may have support from the leadership. It means that you have to sometimes spend more time with those persons to help them understand. I was a big fan of even help allowing legislators to tour institutions so that they can see firsthand rather than from hearsay.
And were they open to that? Was that something they were willing to do?
Usually they are, but they were more interested if they had a prison in their legislative district. Because they got, I think, more mileage out of doing that. It was they became they had constituents who work in the prisons, and then it was a big budget issue for some towns. Sometimes prisons were the Amazon of small communities in the state, and they wanted to be a part of it. So and they wanted to make sure that prisons were operating as safely as they possibly could, and they needed to know as much about it as they could understand because they had constituents who worked there and they would often talk with them.
So let's transition to talk about another sort of boundary spanning activity. Just now we're talking about you in your role as director, reaching outside the organization to deal with the legislature. But by being a director, there are 20 some other cabinet level agencies and organizations in state government. And presumably you weren't just a silo, you perhaps had to work with some of those other agencies. Tell us, which were the types of agencies you had to collaborate with, and how did you foster that collaboration?
Sure, yeah, there were the other, cabinet level agencies but there were also boards and commissions, and oftentimes you would cross paths with their functions. And so, but it was mostly the cabinet level agency directors that was the most critical in terms of collaboration. And just about at every turn, every agency had some interaction with all the other agencies, especially the institution agencies. There were criminal justice clusters, for example, the Highway Patrol, the Department of Youth Services, and the National Guard, where you would have just kind of a professional interaction. But at the time, we operated farms, so I worked closely with the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Natural Resources. Of course, we had prisoners with mental health challenges, and we would have to work with the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Developmental Disabilities. So there was a few agencies that we didn't have some sort of at least irregular contact with.
So you've just painted a picture that lots of different agencies and at various times you might need collaborative relationships. How did you build that? Were those pre-existing relationships that predated you, built by the previous director, or were those things that you had to foster de novo? And if so, how do you do that?
Well, sometimes there were relationships that were in place before I was appointed director. An example would be the Ohio Department of Alcohol and Drug Addiction Services, and that agency is now spun into the Department of Mental Health. But that agency was responsible for auditing and counseling the department on substance abuse, alcohol addiction training, for prisoners, and that's something we did long before I was appointed director. When I became director, however, we looked at how we could intensify that relationship with that particular agency. As director, one of the biggest challenges that we had was working with prisoners who were diagnosed with a mental illness. And so it became extremely important that we work with the State Department of Mental Health, in addition to what was the Ohio Department of Mental Retardation and Developmental Disabilities, now just the Department of Developmental Disabilities, because we had a lot of, and still do have, prisoners who have intellectual disabilities, even though they're not been diagnosed with a mental illness.
How do you build those relationships? Was that a responsibility you took on as director, or did you have sort of staff who were involved, or both?
Yeah, kind of both, but I think it starts at the top. At cabinet meetings, we would caucus with persons and explain issues, and they would do the same with me if there was a concern. We would, have lunch, pick up the telephone, have conference call. We didn't have, the luxury of texting and Zooming and all those kinds of things in those days. It was, beep somebody, or set up a lunchtime between administrative assistants. But it seemed to work, and we didn't know the difference, that we weren't as efficient as anybody else. But you just have to take a personal initiative, and you do that by developing personal relationships with those persons, and not just casual ones where we see each other every so often.
I struggle with this as a leader in a higher ed setting. As you and I are doing right now, you use the word efficiency. It's so easy to just jump on Zoom and have a call, have a conversation. And yet I feel something's missing. I miss the pleasure of just sitting in a room and chatting with you. We had a nice lunch a month ago, and I got the pleasure of getting to know you a little better then. If you were director now, would you counsel yourself to say, oh, it would be so easy to just jump on Zoom, but maybe it's better for me to walk across the street and meet for lunch? What do you think you'd do?
Yeah, I love talking to you over Zoom. I love talking to a lot of other people when there is when another option doesn't exist, but I'd much rather meet you on campus at a coffee shop, you
Yep.
know, um, and that wasn't the same, position, that I held as director. I mean, I would much rather, sit down and talk for 20 minutes rather than to Zoom, because you also get involved in small talk. I mean, it's good to even know more about the person than what they do, for the state of Ohio. So I think in those situations, you know, you develop the friendships. Even to this day, there are people, who I worked with in the cabinet who are friends to this day because we just did not meet. We met on a personal basis and a professional one at the same time.
Yeah, I'm interested over the next decade, or maybe even sooner, we'll learn a lot as Zoom and other means of communication become so much a part of not just our personal lives, but our professional lives. How that's going to change, and whether you and I are just old guys that like to sit
Of
and
course,
meet
we didn't have
people.
COVID-19 to
We didn't
contend
have
with back then.
COVID-19 to contend with. But as a leadership lesson, I'm a big believer in just what you said, those interpersonal connections. Getting to know someone makes doing business a lot easier. And it builds that trust that I think is necessary to speak on behalf of your organization. And I'm just very curious to see whether we move away from that as everything becomes hybrid and virtual. Particularly in a state where you're physically located, and we concentrated all these agencies primarily downtown. It'll be an interesting thing to watch over time.
Sounds like a study the Glenn College did.
Indeed. Let's switch topics a little bit and talk about your area of work. You obviously do a lot of things. You've done some stuff in the higher ed space that I want to get to eventually, but corrections and law enforcement has been central to your professional life for a long time. And it's central to the life of state government. It's consistently one of the top priority issues for state government, particularly when we look and see how states spend their money. So you mentioned earlier that your term as director was a time of a dramatic increase in the state's prison and jail population, and that was not unique to Ohio. That was a national trend. What was your personal position on the growth of the prison population? Were you troubled by it, or was this, as you just said, this was just the job? And did it change the way you thought about your leadership, given that you'd been in the system for a long time?
The fact that we had prisons that were extremely crowded, and much to my consternation, didn't keep me from, carrying out my responsibilities as head of that agency. And there were other things that I probably philosophically disagreed with, but I still, carried the responsibility out because it came with the job. During the time when, prisons became more and more crowded, it was not just an administrative nightmare for me. It was a personal social justice nightmare. Because I had become exposed to correctional systems around the world, and we placed a lot of emphasis on locking people up, and not just for a couple of months here and there, but for long periods of time. And we not only did that, but once they got out, we have all of these collateral sanctions or extra punishments that we impose on people simply because they have a felony conviction. So this whole idea of go to prison, do your time, keep your nose clean doesn't exist. You have to contend with all of what you're not going to have access to. In some cases, it's licensures, it's driver's licenses, it's access to certain housing, simply because you have a felony conviction, even though that conviction had no nexus to what you may be prevented from being a part of.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it was something that to this day, I still, talk about to audiences. Uh, but I still had a job to do. I think the responsibility of a director, take me, for example, I thought my responsibility of managing the agency was in addition to, my ability to have a bully pulpit about, how the system should fix itself.
So I want to hear a little bit more about that. I'm fascinated. So I really appreciate you sharing that social justice perspective. And yet you said, but I still had a job to do. How did you, either personally or professionally, how did you square those two things where you clearly saw the need for change in the system, and yet the system was growing rapidly? How did you try to simultaneously manage the growth while also using the bully pulpit to argue for change? How did you do that?
Well, I think, reducing, the agency to lower common denominators, such as education, for example. We know, based on research that we conducted, as well as national research, that the more education you have, the less likely you might be, to reconvict or to be reconvicted of crime. But people generally don't know that. So we have to tell them. And if we don't tell them, then shame on us. The same thing with alcohol and other drug abuse. There, at the time when I was director, on average, 80% of all persons who came to prison had a documented history of alcohol or other drug abuse. That's a big number.
Yep.
And so we needed to remediate that to a degree that we could. So we offered programs in prisons. But that wasn't good enough. We had to make sure that once they got out, they had access, to addiction abatement programs. The list can go on. What do you do about persons who were part of street gangs? How do you get them to renounce their affiliation? So there are, to me, it was just a matter of kind of dissecting the agency and taking it piece by piece, because if you looked at it as a whole, then you might be trying to boil the ocean.
So now we're in, and not an era that's the reverse, but after a couple decades of dramatic growth in the prison population, it seemed to have stabilized a decade ago. And now we're in an era where I think there are a variety of efforts to reduce the prison population, whether it's diversion, decriminalizing certain things that used to be felonies, or a variety of other approaches. Do you see all of this as good, given your social justice or inclinations that you just mentioned, or are there things you're concerned about in this era?
Sure. I guess I wouldn't say stabilized. I know that when you compare 80s, 90s, trends to this millennium trends, it may look different, but today even there's still a major problem.
Yep.
There's a major problem with communities in terms of shootings. It's scary to me when you see people shooting people in other cars just driving down the interstate. It's scary when you have to put extra patrols of police officers in municipal parks. So something is not right. Something needs to happen at a more grassroots level. And I have always been one to believe that as the head of the prison system, I'm not responsible for everything that happens regarding, the justice system and even persons who leave prison. But I would be remiss to say I shouldn't have a major role. And I have assumed that, and I think it was always a part of my second nature to, not just be a person who has to carry out a job, but also to help influence, how reform can best be exercised.
Let's switch to one of those areas of reform. You mentioned earlier that education is a big covariate, correlate with being in prison. The absence of it, as you said, leads to greater likelihood. Is it fair to ask, is that perhaps why you've been so committed to higher education as a cause? I read somewhere that at a time in your life before you entered this line of work, you wanted to be a university president. What is your passion for higher education sort of similarly driven?
I'm not sure what came first. I guess is what I'm thinking. I have always wanted to know what the answer was to improving conditions in society.
Mhm.
And universities do that by educating students and better preparing them to go back into communities and be productive.
Mhm.
Well, so the notion was, why wouldn't that same theory work for prison?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we, have, career tech, vocational, um, you know, um, academic, post-secondary education programs in prison that do the same thing? But yet we got complaints that, why should, inmates have the opportunity to get a college degree when they, committed these crimes? And and my answer would be, well, who do you want sitting next to you on public transportation? Somebody who is uneducated, somebody who's pissed off, or somebody who's educated and on their way to work.
Yep.
So education to me has always been kind of a stabilizing concept that I could always fall back on.
Mhm. So now you've spent the last almost 2 decades involved in the life of universities, helping people access them. You've now served on the boards of 2 universities here in Ohio, so you have some insight into how they're organized and managed and governed. Do you see any parallels between the sort of role of director of a state agency, namely Department of Corrections, and universities, or are they totally different kinds of enterprises?
No, they're not different constructs at all. There's probably, from my perspective, more similarities than there are differences. And take Ohio State, for example. I mean, it's a state-based university, and I say based because it's only a small percentage of its funding is from this the Ohio legislature. But they still have to follow state rules. They have to follow the budgeting process, the ethics process, the personnel rules, and which were the same ones that I had to manage as the head of the state prison system. So there are some administrative functions that are exactly the same.
Mhm.
I think the mission is very similar in terms of bringing somebody into the organization, whether it's higher education, prison, or hospital, the military. You want that person to be better off when they leave than when they first got there.
Yep.
So, theoretically, there are a lot of similarities. Of course, there are differences. I don't go out and lobby people and name buildings after them. I don't do a number of things that we do now that but even with Ohio State, their mission is different. It's a land grant university. It's not just there to serve the students. It's there to serve the entire state.
Yep.
And that's what I love about the role of the trusteeship at OSU.
So thinking about those 2 roles, role of a university president, say, and a director of state agency, are there general leadership lessons that you think apply just as we sort of pull this conversation to a close? Are there things that you think are transferable across those contexts?
I think the leadership lessons are rather rather universal and transferable. Um, and it goes beyond just whether it's a state agency or university. I think there's similar our leadership roles for the private sector, corporations, businesses, nonprofit, or organizations. I think, the difference has become in the specific mission, that you have and what you have to do. And many of those are more management functions than they are leadership functions. And
Yep.
when you become a leader, I mean, it's your responsibility to, make sure that you have the right talent, that the culture of the organization is one that is going to be an advantage for the group. I am a big believer that there are leadership principles and theories that are rather universal, regardless of the type of organization you're affiliated.
Well, Reggie, thank you for this informative, engaging conversation. And more importantly, thank you for your multiple decades of service to the state of Ohio and personally to The Ohio State University. We are benefiting from your wisdom and your good governance. So thank you for joining me today, and thank you for serving us.
It's my pleasure, Trevor.